And if you have any questions, we'll be doing a Q&A for both speakers at the end. So thank you to Safa and Dr. for that wonderful conversation.
Yes, we're taking our masks. It's everyone else. Almost.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kaul, for being here. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. So I guess I just want to start it off with a kind of a broad question, given that the topic of our conversation is the future of Indian democracy. So sort of broadly speaking, how would you characterize like, the state and the security of Indian democracy now versus other points in the country's history? Oh, no problem. Sorry about that.
So first of all, thank you to everyone for being here, to the organizers, to all of you for making all this effort and making this happen. These kinds of spaces are really vital, and especially more so because they are harder to curate and to sustain in contemporary India. They're not absolutely impossible yet, but they become rarer, and with more enforced or self-censorship, that becomes more predominant. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation. And also, I'm really glad that we're recording it, because I feel like one of the other things of amplifying and sustaining our voices is to make sure that it can reach beyond people who are able to physically participate in any space. Now, turning to your first question, as part of this conversation, so your question really is how can one summarize the state of Indian democracy right now as opposed to at other points in time? Now, I would say, the possibly the most obvious thing is something that others have noted too, which is that we seem to be in a period of undeclared emergency. So in the past, when democracy was subverted in the history of post-colonial India, that was done by decree. Everybody knew that this was a state of exception. What is different about the present state is that similar sorts of things are happening to an extent, yet they're happening without any declaration of an emergency-like situation. So that's the first thing. The other thing that I would like to point out, because for me, it is very important to constantly be able to zoom out and see these dynamics, both structurally and as they are at work across national boundaries. And that internationalist perspective, especially when we are talking about democracy, is really important, since this is not something that is happening in India. It's taking its own particular form in different countries, but this kind of right-wing, hegemonic, authoritarian subversion of democracy has been happening in multiple countries. So in that context, what I would also say is that this is part of a global ascendancy of right-wing hegemonic political projects. So that's the other thing that I would say about what's happening with Indian democracy. And that has two parts. So one is the fact that this is happening in other countries. And the other is the extent to which this is happening under the radar, as it were. So that when authoritarian moves are carried out by states that are explicitly authoritarian, say China, for example, that everyone in the world notices that a lot more than what is happening in India, because it's not as if the courts have been shut down, the newspapers have been stopped, and every other institution has been dismantled. All of these continue to exist. They're just not serving the purpose that they are meant to serve in a remotely healthy democracy. So that's the other thing that I would say. But on each of these, I mean, I'm happy to speak further on these points if you wish.
Well, I guess to elaborate on the point you brought up, you said undeclared emergency. Obviously, when Indira Gandhi declared emergency, it was almost very simple. You write it, sign a decree, and then you shut down the press. You seize control of the institution. But for the emergency to be undeclared, I imagine it requires, more, I it's more of a little more complex process. So are there specific institutions or specific mechanisms by which the Modi government is able to sort of subvert democracy in India while remaining under the radar in its subversion?
See, so I guess one of the things to note also at the outset is that democracy as a system, including in its most liberal versions, is not entirely antithetical to the exercise and to the continuation of violence. So while we might step outside that and think that democracy and violence are completely opposed things, that's not really the case, because there is a structural violence that is a part of democracies, in that democracy is, for the most part, conceived of as a political arrangement, not in terms of what that means for economic rights. So it is possible to have a democracy where people don't actually have healthcare, don't have housing, are suffering from all other kinds of violence, which is very structural and inbuilt and normalized as part of the system. So democracy in that sense has, violence is a key part of democracies. Secondly, also, in the very exercise of democratic institutions and in the legitimation of electoral legitimation through the holding of elections, often is marked in multiple countries, not just in India, but in other parts of, I would have said, global south, but the global north too, by the increase in violence. So elections themselves also involve an increase in violence. So democracy and violence are not opposite, therefore. And then you have to also square with the fact that the very idea that we have democracy as a political system where you can choose from amongst different sets of in a polyarchy sense competing elites, but even then one question that I would say, it's not possible for people in pretty much most democracies, to even liberal ones, to elect governments that can bring the markets down, right? And so parties that promise a welfare agenda often are not the parties that reflect a good performance in the markets, because and on the opposite side, parties that are backed by strong corporate forces and often have a very nationalist agenda are loved by the markets. So there's also an economic aspect that is crucial to this, and in that sense, all of those provisos, all of those sort of all of those issues about democracy notwithstanding. So I'm going to say that all of that exists in the backdrop and we recognize that. But nonetheless, the point is that you should have institutions that can offer some safeguard against all of that, so that the depredation is not absolutely extreme. And in that sense, I think that the in the Indian case, what's happening is that allowing for that outer circle that I mentioned, there's also like the lack of the institutions increasingly that are needed to have transparency, accountability, and and some version of justice being delivered in a manner that it's not just revenge and vendetta. So that it's so that if corruption is being targeted, it should be targeted across the board, not just selectively against one's political opponents. And I think that those subversions of institutional subversions that are happening are multidimensional, and others have noted them too. The response of the judiciary in various cases, the issues with the election commission, in that in the last elections, in the 2019 elections, one election commissioner did not attend many of the meetings later because he was not happy with some of the decisions. So there's enough and more documentation also of how institutions are really under pressure, and those within those institutions who want to not completely abide by this project are under pressure too, at a very high cost to themselves. So this subversion of democracy is something that proceeds apace. It's happening in the institutional domain. It's happening ideologically in terms of the shifting the public common sense, and of course, it's also happening at a more electoral political level, and in that sense. So it's multidimensional. It's kind of symbolic, material, structural, in every way. It's functional.
Well, thank you. Yeah. And so I suppose sort of building off of that, many observers have kind of pointed out that a major sort of aspect of this sort of subversion of democracy has been by centralizing power in the central government in Delhi. But of course, India, like constitutionally, has a federalist structure. There's a good deal of governing power in the states rather than the central government. And so given that India, at least nominally, does remain sort of in a federalist system, are there certain states or certain parts of the country where you feel democracy is relatively stronger, and alternatively where you feel it's relatively weaker?
So Okay, I'll start by responding to the last bit of your question, and the easiest way to look at that for all their problems indices are to an extent some kind of summarizations. So if we look at the Freedom House Index on Democracy, then India was recently in the last version of it. India was it went from being democratic to being like partly free. Nonetheless, Kashmir is not ranked. So that ranking pertains to all of the other parts of the country, minus the territory of Kashmir that, that in international legal terminology would be categorized as India and Pakistan administered territories. So Kashmir on both sides is ranked as not free. Whereas, so if you're asking me what is the difference in the extent of liberties and rights that people have and freedoms that they have, then yeah, the rankings clearly reflect that. I mean, that's not free, whereas India is ranked as partly free now. So there is that. In terms of the centralizing, yes, I think this is a point that opposition leaders in India have ever more sought to make, and Congress leaders, especially Rahul Gandhi, not so long ago, I think earlier this year, made quite the speech in Parliament about this, like saying that fundamentally, constitutionally, it's a federal structure that we're talking about. It cannot be a country that's ruled from the center. That there is a federal structure. Now, constitutional structures are not what most people think about. So there's that. Also, if we look at the previous, the kind of work on Modi's tenure in Gujarat, that centralizing tendency was already quite evident in the way in which, praise or blame was apportioned to whether a policy went well or went badly. So there's that aspect of it. Is there more centralization? Yes. Is it possible to evidence that? Certainly, yes. Because in one of the early kind of in the first term of this government, one of the things they did was they abolished, certain kinds of consultative procedures and the idea of within government. And the idea of doing that was to lessen bureaucracy, so decisions could be reached faster. Now, decisions were reached faster, I'm sure, but the whole point of deliberative democracy and all that noise, messy noise, is that it serves a purpose. That's what democracy looks like in practice. And by doing away with some of those procedures, and so the place to read about this, where I've written about it, is an article in the Journal of Labor and Society called The Rise of the Right in India, Modi Myth, Hindutva Development and Dualities. So in that, I go into detail explaining how this works as a political strategy, but those sorts of elimination of detailed deliberation and consultations is how this, and that's, is how this is achieved. But that's sold as this is going to make things more efficient.
Right.
But yet what we see in terms of what it has made more efficient is that you then get a whole lot of clearances that, that don't have to bother about environmental or labor or other rules. So it is a kind of efficiency, but it's ideologically an efficiency meant to deliver systematic outcomes that work in the interests of certain, capital accumulation structures, and that's what they've been doing. That's what efficiency looks like when it's delivered within that neoliberal nationalist framework, as they've been doing.
Thank you. And in the first part of your answer to that question, you brought up Kashmir, which is actually a great segue into my next question. I know that much of your work, both sort of creative and academic work, has of course focused on Kashmir, and especially since August 2019, the state's policies there have severely undermined democracy and human rights. So my question is, do you think that the Indian government's policies in Kashmir, particularly under Modi, but not necessarily only under Modi, do you think that that has sort of broader implications for the state and future of democracy in India as a whole, and the rest of India?
So yes, the one-word answer would be yes. Definitely has implications. In the broader sense, as Martin Luther King Jr. said, in that most fundamental of lines, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. You can also see the ways in which how historically, for example, what was seen as doable in the colonial peripheries of the empire eventually came home to the imperial metropolises in terms of both, strategies of repression, for example. Think about even specific strategies. I'm referring here, at the back of my head, when I refer to things, I'm also thinking of bits of work that I do. And if I'm not able to go into great detail because of the length of time here, it's all available on my website in the CV. So if you want to read further. But say, think of something like tear gas or other technologies. They were used. All of these technologies are first used at the peripheries and then they come home.
Right.
And if you think about the sorts of repression of protests that has been happening and that has been normal in Kashmir, and how that is, how that is happening now in mainland in India, where so there's that way in which technologies of repression circulate and are normalized. There's also the way in which, of course, the other link between the subversion. So the question of consent, the fact that the consent of Kashmiris is not deemed when the autonomy is revoked, says something quite fundamental about how governance is seen, what political rights are meant to matter. I'm sure everyone in this room already knows that in August 2019, with the Article 370, the changes to the Constitution in India, the Article 370, which had provisions that referred to the autonomy of Kashmir, they were removed overnight without any consultation or consent being sought of the people of Kashmir. And at the same time, there was the telecommunications and internet ban, which was the longest ever in a democracy and continued well into the onset of the coronavirus situation. So the very basic way in which Kashmir functions as a trope in Indian hyper-nationalist imagination and its uses for Indian electoral outcomes of this right-wing project is by portraying Kashmiri Muslims as latent terrorists and Kashmiri Hindus as selectively as a community of people who have exceptionally suffered. To, of course, to prevent any forming of solidarity, there is a lot of discourse invested in the preventing of forming of solidarities between Indians and Kashmiris, who may have, right suppression in common, between Kashmiri Pandits and Kashmiri Muslims, so that the communal discourse serves useful political ends for this project. And the doing of it is to portray all of Kashmir as an Islamist problem, because that then creates its mirror. It's like Hindu fundamentalism is required because we are dealing with Islamic fundamentalism. So the nuances of so it's a position that is rooted from an inability to distinguish between the fact that that Pakistan-backed proxy insurgency Islamism is not the same as at different points in historic time, in late 20th, early 21st century, is not the same as accumulated resentments and indigenous, resistance to Indian occupation. So there are all kinds of things that are lost in this picture, and that leads to continued rights suppression. And the very basic fact that I think most Indians are neither exposed to nor often very aware of, which is the fact of the political dispute, that there is a reason why there is a dotted line on the map. And the reason it's a dotted line is because it's a dispute that the UN spent years, if not decades, dealing with in the middle of the 20th century. It's a political dispute. Any political science IR scholar would look at the documents, I can show you stuff that we all know. It's a political dispute. It's an unresolved political dispute that is entrenched. It's a territorial dispute and it needs resolution. And the way to resolve a political dispute is, one way of dealing with that is to constantly militarize it. Right. And that's what's been happening. But it's not serving the people, and certainly not serving not just the Kashmiris, whom it is oppressing and dividing, and solidarity is killing, but it's also, it creates an environment for the banalization of violence in India. And for the use of the weaponization of Kashmiri suffering for political purposes that Hindutva seeks to benefit from in India. So yeah, there are definitely both ideological and technological material.
Thank you for those insights. And so you bring up the portrayal of Kashmir, both the portrayal of Kashmiri Muslims, but also the Kashmiri Pandits and their experiences and suffering. So of course I have to bring up the Kashmir Files. And in March you published a really powerful essay in the News Minute entitled "Kashmir is Not a File: Propaganda and Politics in India," which I really recommend you all read. It was really, really fascinating, one of my introductions to your work. But in that, you sort of critique the film Kashmir Files from your own perspective, both as a Kashmiri Pandit and as a scholar who has great expertise and has written on this issue. So could you share a bit broadly about your thoughts on the film, about sort of the reception to it in India, but also abroad, especially in the diaspora? And again, tying it back to democracy, what do you think the implications are of the film and its sort of massive overnight popularity for democracy in India?
So I have mixed feelings about responding to this question, because one of the things that really strikes me about how the rights discourse manages to take up all of the space that exists is that we also give it all of the attention in the world. And I don't think that's really necessary. So for instance, when I was asked constantly about, what do you think about this film? It wasn't something I either wanted to watch or write about. So, in summary, as you said, the article's out there, people can read it. And it's communal propaganda. It serves a purpose. It's a caricature. It highlights, selectively spotlights events that are part of a larger story without drawing any attention to the larger story. And of course, it's, as to anyone watching it would be clear, it's also an Islamophobic morality tale kind of a thing where all Muslims are bad and, all of the others are victims. The one thing that I would say is that it does make this attempt to undermine, it puts a lot of effort into undermining solidarities between Kashmiri Pandits and Kashmiri Muslims and Indians and Kashmiris. And I think that's vital because the fact that it needs to do that perhaps to me indicates that there's some hope of such solidarities having been burgeoning. So that's all I want to say about the film. But what I do want to say is that I would rather that, that you all went and read my novel, future tense. And the reason for that is because the right wing's bloody well never going to talk about it. The progressives in India aren't going to be able to talk about it because it's a novel that references contemporary Kashmir. So it texts that we write about. That's what I said. I said, nobody is going to ask, nobody goes up to Vishal Bhardwaj and says, what do you think about the Kashmiri, the novel? So the first novel in English by a Kashmiri novelist, which I wrote, Residue, which came out a few years ago. And that was set in Berlin, referencing that history. And this one, Future Tense, is all about, it's written out of thinking and kind of spectating and meditating about the pain of Kashmiris. So I'm like, nobody goes up to Vishal Bhardwaj and says, what do you think about this Kashmiri woman novelist and what she has to say about Kashmir? So why do I, as a woman, as a public intellectual, in spite of decades, a decade and more of work across the spectrum, have to be asked about some, random communal propaganda? It's just, like I understand at one level that it's a cultural text. But what I feel that for the left and for the progressives, I feel like we need to shift the frames. I feel like it's really important that we don't buy into what is set up for us as the relevant terrain of discussion on India, on Kashmir, on whatever, because that just serves, to amplify what is already out there. Like the media, the television, WhatsApp, everything is saturated with communal propaganda. And my point is, how do we move beyond that? And that's really hard, and especially now with the diaspora. One thing with these cultural texts and their link to democracy is that anyone making a film today about, about a similar massacre, like, in that film they refer to the, to a massacre of Kashmiri Pandits, making a similar film about a massacre of Kashmiri Muslims, or going back in history, we think about, 47 Jammu, or any kind of other events. There's no way, no chance that film would ever get even like a theater to show it without people throwing stones and shutting it down. And here we have, activists going about in UP, going to film theaters and bullying them into showing this film. So that's how much government ministers speaking out in support of giving tax-free status to a text, which is, to anyone watching it, so clearly and blatantly serving an agenda. And I'm like, we should, read that article that he's mentioning, but there's a lot more that I've said, which I would rather also that you read that. It's just like, it's just these, did I say Vishal Bhardwaj, by the way? That's not what I meant. I do need to edit that. I was thinking the wrong director's name. What's his name? Vivek Agnihotri, sorry. Edit that part, which Vivek Agnihotri I was referring to. Nothing against the guy who makes the Shakespeare films. So, yeah, anyway.
No, thank you. That was a great answer. Again, you should read not only the article, but also the latest novel, which I don't know how you've been predicting the questions I'm asking before I do, but the next question I have on the list, in addition to being an academic, a scholar, professor, you're also a poet and a novelist. And I wanted to ask you about how you feel sort of your scholarly pursuits and how they intersect with your creative efforts, and what role do you feel that writers, artists, creative, any sort of creative has to play in resisting threats to democracy and resisting fascist ideologies such as
So yeah, so I think all texts, everything is political. The personal is political. We strongly believe that there's no place which is not in some way riven with micro political, at least, effects. So we are constantly inhabiting a space of invisible current, and we are situating ourselves within various kinds of political, political as political beings and in political relationalities with people and things around us. So to me, that these are seamless pursuits, because I feel that just as when we speak in English and we speak in Hindi and we speak in Kashmir or Gujarati or Bengali or whatever, we speak in different languages in different audiences. So to me, it's almost the same as speaking in different languages of thought.
Sure.
And that enables different things to happen. So what academic work does is it allows me to analytically intervene and to understand, okay, how is this political project functioning? How does this, how does the manipulation of contradictory constituencies with a fork-tongued speech, or how does post-colonial neoliberal nationalism work in this context? How does misogyny work for these right-wing hegemonic projects? So that's an analytical perspective. And the other part is an affective aspect of it. And both, I really do think that poetry and politics must be the twin strands of our existential DNA. And for me, that feels very, very natural. It feels like, you want to be able to say why something happened, and you want to also allow yourself to feel the joy or the grief in reaction to the fact that it happened. And that's really it. At another level, I think stories are what make a lot of things happen. Actions are motivated by ideas, and stories are really powerful in challenging certain modes of entrenched thought. And that especially in relation to sort of injustices. If we think about historical injustices, then it's nearly impossible for us, I think, to think about historic events and not think about the novels, the fiction, the stories that were a key part in making people think a certain way. So I feel that storytelling drives a lot of human endeavor, and that especially in contexts of conflict or contestation, stories are a very powerful resource to get people to be to encounter, to come face to face with things they otherwise might not, because not everyone reads peer-reviewed articles. Right. So I think stories are a good way of doing that, if for whoever that's possible. So for me, there's no kind of either or. Sure. Although of course in terms of time, it feels like it's always a struggle.
Yeah.
And as one grows older, I kind of think of the reconciling that, the line, I think from Zora Neale Hurston, the ears that ask questions and ears that answer. You just do what you do, and there are different forms that it takes. But in an ideal world, I think I would write a lot more poetry. And sort of do that a lot more than I can at present, because there's all of this that I also need to make sense of. So, but for me, they're seamless. There's no kind of contradiction or conflict in doing this or doing that.
Thank you so much. We have time for just one more question. So I want to sort of bring it back to the topic of democracy in India, but focusing on the diaspora. Obviously, you live and work in the UK, University of Westminster, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to what role the Indians specifically in the diaspora, both in the UK and in the US, you feel plays in contributing to the current situation and threats facing India's democracy.
So yeah, so the thing about the Indian, but not just Indian diaspora in the West, is that very often their concerns in India are with majority rights, and in the West with minority rights. That they're concerned with these sorts of issues here, but not there, and it's quite segmented. There's also the way in which the more that a person is away, perhaps, as a collectivity, not always true in every individual case, the more rarefied and purified idea of a homeland that they have, that they feel like they have a yearning to go back to at some point, if not really. And these paradoxes, I think, make for a very peculiar relationship to, to kind of nationalism. And, many people have written about it, of what this kind of long distance nationalism does. But I co-authored something with a colleague and PhD student of mine, a book chapter called Hindutva in the Diaspora, Hindutva in the Diaspora, Paradoxes and Entanglements, that came out last year. Yeah, last year. Where we were referring precisely to the ways in which, specifically in the US and UK, there is a version of spirituality, of the use of political spectacles, and how Hindutva is repurposed in the diaspora to create a certain idea of who the Indians are and how they are Hindu, and to kind of create a gloss over questions of caste. So for instance, one of the things that the Hindutva lobby, as it were, in the UK is very opposed to making caste discrimination, to making caste discrimination explicitly stated as a discrimination.
Right.
So they really object to that, and they have had in spite of the various kind of consultations that the government has put out, they've always very staunchly opposed this, saying caste is a colonial Western invention. That by saying that caste discrimination is it should not be allowed, you are actually creating an idea of caste. So there are very specific strategies, of course, that diaspora uses, and on campuses. So we were specifically looking, in fact, a lot at campuses. How, especially for second generation Indians or South Asians, the idea is that just as we were speaking about earlier, that the idea is, oh well, why don't you come to this away day and learn about your culture, and play this game and learn about your gods and learn about your history. And through that, to kind of get people to be interested in a project that is actually a project that then says, okay, but don't you want your country to be proud? Don't you want to be, proud Indians in the diaspora? And I think pride is a key part of, by the way, part of it is economic and that whole Rising India thing. But the other thing is the way in which the idea of pride is sold. And if you think about the fact that even in multicultural Western societies, minorities, and especially racial minorities, haven't always been, there has been a strong discourse through which they've been othered, right-wing discourse in the West. So to people with that experience, although not only exclusively those people, there is an appeal in this idea of pride, just as the idea of pride also is sold in India. And these spectacles serve a purpose in that once you have these big shenanigans overseas, they're beamed on Indian TV, and people look at that and they think, wow, our project and our leader is globally loved. And so this serves, there's a feedback loop between what happens here, how it is projected there, and how, these things work in tandem. So yeah, it's the diaspora has a crucial role, but as you guys are doing this, I mean, I think it's really important for people to stand up and say, not in our name. That, to be Hindu doesn't mean that you have to be, and it would be tragic if any religion had to have only this idea of a fundamentalism where to be a Hindu means that you have to hate all Muslims and you have to, kind of subscribe to a fundamentalist version of political use of religion. So it's really important, and and the very fact that organizations such as the ones that are co-organizing this, I think it's really important to show that it's possible to have a sense of solidarity and speaking out against injustices. And the last thing I think that I want to say is about location. So people like me, people like all of us in this room probably will always be tarnished or sought to be tarnished by the purveyors of Hindutva as the fact that we are somehow inauthentic because we are not geographically in India. I mean, it's one of the most common ways of delegitimizing any critique of injustice, of what's going on, or critical thinking in India, is to say, oh, what do you know? You are, you're sitting in the West and whatever, etc. Now the thing, so that's not just false, it's also, and spurious, it's also very toxic. And I feel like we must push back against it all the time. Location is not just a matter of geography. the multi-billionaire who lives down on the same street with a person who doesn't have, who irons clothes for a living, is Mumbai or is in Delhi or is in Guwahati or Srinagar, whatever. That doesn't mean that person's geographical location gives them any particular insight into where they are or what they have to say.
Right.
Whereas people like us who spend so much of our time and energy thinking and working and speaking and writing about these things are sought to be delegitimized. Oh, because you're Western. I feel like that is so powerful though, but so dangerous. For them, it's really powerful because they can just say, you're not here. And I feel like we have to keep saying, yeah, we're not there, but being there isn't what really matters here. Location isn't just about geography. So that's, I think, for the diaspora, I think that is, we have to be less shy about the fact that we're physically not in a space, because what the space of our engagement is where we are, not the geographical kind of coordinate on the globe where we are. And that's important. So yeah, that's what I want to sort of close on.
Now I'd like to invite Safa and Anand to come back up, and we'll have 15 minutes to answer any audience questions that we may have.
We need one more chair.
Yes, here in the.
Oh, would you be able to sit on that chair?
Oh, no, I'm fine.
Backwise.
I'll give you another chair.
Yeah, fine.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, much more than myself.
I guess we have one question here.
For any democracy, electoral process is very important, as you all know. How credible and independent is the current electoral commission as an institute? And what do you think is a way forward to uphold the integrity of the institute? Either of you
Yeah, that's better.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So a few questions. Sure. One in the back here.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is, do you think judiciary in India is independent enough? If there were to be any laws passed by the executive branch that would be unconstitutional or go against the secular state, is the judiciary strong enough to oppose that? That's one question. The other one is, well, we have these superstars, Amir Khan, Shah Rukh Khan, Salman Khan. They give so many super duper hits, regardless of whether you like Bollywood or not. That would not have been possible without the strong support of so many Hindus watching those movies, right? So, what do you attribute that to? This dichotomy, like, okay, don't like Muslims, but those three are, superstars. So, what is your take?
I have a question. During the research, did you find any connection between the policies of India's neighbors and the rise of Hindu nationalism?
The two questions for the electoral commission and the judiciary. Oh yes. Sorry.
So the academic, the world of academics has come under serious attack by the Hindu right-wing forces in the West. Last year in September 2021, an online virtual conference called Dismantling Global Hindutva was organized. And the Hindu right-wing, the Hindu American Foundation, which is based in the US, they themselves wrote on Twitter that they had got 1 million emails and hundreds of thousands of phone calls made to harass all these universities, 70 plus universities, to withdraw. None of them withdrew eventually. Just yesterday, I was reading that some 14 scholars had resigned somewhere in the University of Melbourne in Australia because some India-related institute was refusing to discuss the rise of Hindu nationalism. Professor Audrey Trushke here in the US, she has had to silence her Twitter, responses to her Twitter. She has had to take police support, police help. Vikram Sampath has filed cases against the academicians. So, how do you see, what do you think is happening? Why are they attacking academicians? Are they attacking academicians in the UK, such as yourselves? And where do you see this headed globally?
Thanks again. So many questions. I don't think justice to all of them. In terms of Electoral Commission India, how credible it is, how strong it is. Again, if you take example of the history of that issue in India, even under Congress, we know that it would go up and down, right? There was only one period of time where it felt that it had some kind of independence. That's an autonomy when there was no strong one party in power. So I do think that while election commission is there, it's not really neutral, but there are opportunities in Indian democracy, people mobilize to make the change via elections. So I don't think that what I'm saying is it's not autonomous completely, but it will depend partly on what the electors vote for. So there might be small fumbling here and there, and few seats might be lost here and there, but generally I would still say that it's not the institution person that's failing the election commission, it's largely the public. I do put the responsibility back in terms of the public. In terms of judiciary, again, to what extent it's independent. If we take example of judiciary, the judgment they made, generally it's a lot to be disappointed with. In occasional cases, we get excited, we feel happy when they make good judgments, but that's only occasionally. The change that's happening with watch out for not Supreme Court, but it's the lower courts. And the lower courts are where most of the judgments are made, and most of the fate of Indian democracy is decided in lower courts, not highest courts, right? Of the highest court is only some cases go up, most of them are lower courts. And again, whatever we read about lower courts, generally they tend to go with whatever where the wind is blowing. And given the wind is blowing in favor of Hindutva at this point in time, we don't find many decisions made by lower courts that are challenging Hindu nationalism. And this is how things function. So even while Supreme Court might have some autonomy compared to others, and they have actually full autonomy if they want to. So the challenge is, or the disturbing aspect is, how come Supreme Court judges and High Court judges who have so much autonomy, why are they passing judgments that are so blatantly anti-democratic and pro-Hindutva? I do think that's because they do, and they might be sharing views with the Hindutva. The Hindutva has gone beyond, the RSS, it has gone beyond, BJP, it has become quite pervasive, and that's the larger danger here. In terms of superstars, you're right, I don't think Bollywood, at one point in time, if you look at Bollywood films, they were not Islamophobic. They did represent with all the flaws in Indian secularism, all its flaws. There are a lot of flaws, right? Indian secularism. But in terms of one could be heroes and they could act, but you did not expect very blatant Islamophobic films to become very popular in the past. That's a more recent phenomenon. But take example of Amir Khan, who was seen as a better example than compared to the killer. What's his name? Salman Khan. One of the people, right? Let's not talk about him. Even Shah Rukh Khan was with it. Amir Khan was seen as a voice of the liberal middle class Indians. Him talking of intolerance, and we had that intolerance debate when Modi came to power, and you saw how even Amir Khan had to go silent. Is it that Amir Khan has lost his conscience? No, they know the cost is very high. That's what's transforming. So what's happening with the Hindutva, I would say, is that at every level the cost is being made high for people to oppose it, and people are giving up on all kinds of things. In terms of to what in my own work, I found that, let's say, the policy is Pakistan and Bangladesh, because they're the only two countries that mattered for Hindutva. They didn't care about any other country. Not really. So they would refer from time to time that look what they do to Hindus in Pakistan, look what they do to Hindus in Bangladesh. And one particular major conspiracy they had was on something on Mughalistan. So in Hindutva imagination, there is a particular institute called Mughalistan Research Institute in Bangladesh, which had this conspiracy, right? According to Hindutva, to the real conspiracy to Islamize from Pakistan, Kashmir, UP, Bihar, Bengal, and Bangladesh to create a Mughalistan. Right? So that, and they would say that the whole idea was to fracture India into small pieces. And in that concept, of course, Hyderabad, Deccan would also be the Muslim. They would be part, they would be very Hindu, but that's fine. But that would be part. Of course, in my research, I tried to find, is there a Mughalistan Research Institute based in a particular university? Now, that university is the real university, because the research institute doesn't exist. So I went back into how did that conspiracy come about online, and it was partly, by the way, it was through Texas, a particular organization, I don't know which organization that was, that referred to the dream of breaking up India. That seemed like you have to go through web archive and go through pages, to those pages disappear. It seemed, I don't know the truth, and that's as I look, it seemed like it was a particular evangelist, some person or organization here based in Texas, wanting to look for opportunities in India to save souls, I guess, right? And as part of that was to divide India, break up India. It starts with that, then it becomes a Mughalistan, except that Hindutva, when they imagine that conspiracy, they take small thing and make it big. For them, the Texan connection is gone, the Christian connection is gone largely, it becomes a very Muslim connection. So in that, they did not refer to any specific policy of Bangladesh. They did not refer to any specific policy of Pakistan. So if now, today, even if Pakistan and Bangladesh become completely secular, officially and in fact, even if I don't think it will make a difference. So we have to therefore will not buy into the narrative that they provided. If only Muslims have been secular, if only Christians are left, if only X, Y, Z, we will be good Hindus who will not oppress. That's not the case. I do think, and this may go back to its original, in its origin itself is fascism. And that's what it is. So now, of course, it has spread. One final thing in terms of academia and the challenges we face, context is slightly different. We do face similar kind of challenges in the UK, but in UK context, they're not as mobilized in the US context. They're more mobilized around caste at this point in time, but we know the pressures that are coming. We know the ways in which at protest, if you go on protest on Hindu nationalism or Kashmir or both combined, you do get student organizations that are very pro-India, trying to challenge you and trying to create challenge. They're trying to create problems so that you say something, then they record it and they portray that, look, our professors are trying to bully us. That's already taking place. But the reason why I would say that they are focused on academia is they have done that in India. Like the JNU example and all of the universities. At least there's some complexity. Most students have given up on it, right? So what they're doing is, because they do believe, and I'll link it back to my research, is that the fundamental aim of Hindutva is to change common sense in India and about India. The common sense in India used to be that broadly Akbar was good, Aurangzeb was bad. There were things that went bad, but there were also things that were good. And only way in which India could survive is by being broadly very religious, but also multi-religious and secular in that sense, right? That's common sense in India. And common sense about India was also that India is a democracy, that whatever. So their focus is to change that common sense. If anything, I would say BJP is only one aspect of it. The fundamental desire they have, apart from, of course, genocidal violence against X, Y, Z, is to transform the common sense. Only to transform the common sense can you then justify violence. The transformation of that common sense includes everyday knowledge, it includes academia, it includes schools, it includes knowledge production, think tanks. So there are think tanks that are being propped up now, which are very right-wing, but also think tanks that are not right-wing are gradually being silenced. The kind of talks which Nitasha was earlier talking about, that we can do, we have to ask, can this be, is this possible? So years ago, of course, when I was writing, I did present my work on Hindutva, I presented my work on all kinds of things and said things which are impossible now. And this changed from 2015. So from 2015 onwards, Hindu nationalism disappears from the title. But I'm still speaking and people are inviting me and I speak of nationalism and othering, right? And then gradually it even changes from national othering to something else. So there's still spaces to talk, but it's shrinking, and my fear would be that the shrinking of the space is very rapid, and maybe in a couple of years' time, a few years' time, it will become impossible to talk about it.
So thank you for the questions. I should begin with a proviso that, of course, although we are sharing a stage and talking about similar sorts of things, we don't obviously have an identical analyses, and we have different areas of focus. And so, for instance, I have not worked with Hindu right-wing activists on the ground in any ethnographic way whatsoever. My focus is really about looking at the way in which Hindutva works as a political strategy, especially post 2014, and how that works at the level of what it does with how it combines a certain idea of what I call post-colonial neoliberal nationalism. So how it combines things that are often thought of as opposed, like neoliberalism and nationalism, along with a certain post-colonial idea of where memory and history is used as a resource, so that messianic right-wing leaders of these projects promise a return to a pre-colonial purity, or in some other countries to an imperial nostalgia in the future. So they promise a sort of washing away of the past to a future as past. And so that's kind of my point of intervention into all of this. Now, to answer your questions about the integrity of the electoral processes and institutions, one keeps hearing about the EVMs. I mean, first of all, there is of course factual stuff on the ways in which EVMs can be manipulated. Look on Google Scholar, there's factual stuff on it. Why does it happen in some states than others? I mean, it's conceivable to think of the fact that maybe, where you already control the state machinery, it's easier. But nonetheless, these are not things that can be proven. And certainly these are not the only things that are feeding into the success of this project. So the technological side of it, there's that which is out there factually. In terms of the appointments and the institutions themselves, as I said, with the 2019 elections, there's clear evidence of what happened with the commissioners. Even with this one, with the current elections, the results of which just came out of the regional elections, including UP, the ECI was called out by many people because the person going by the name of Yogi Adityanath, Ajay, he was on TV in the mornings right before the elections. That's, so there's all kinds of other factual things. It's not, it's like the lampshade effect, when something is in front of you, but it's hard to spot for many people. That's how it's working. It's there. So in terms of the integrity of institutions, is that being compromised? I think it's very easy to find evidence across a range of institutions, how they're not functioning in the ways that they might. And the fact that they might have been compromised at other points in history, sure, maybe, but that doesn't excuse what's happening right now. Likewise with the judiciary, if you think about at that time, the Chief Justice Ranjan Gogoi, and you think about the scandal surrounding that, and you think about the fact that the revocation of autonomy in Kashmir, the case, how that, it kept being kicked down the road instead of being addressed properly. There's at least that we do have evidence of judicial quietude, if not of other kinds of judicial, problems. And scholars who study the functioning of judiciary in democracies and what happens as they slide further towards authoritarianism, probably have more comprehensive analyses on this that do exist. The role of, so in my congressional testimony in 2019, I had said that India is on this proto-fascist trajectory, and I stand by that. I think that, for me, it's important to the gradations are important, and that's where I think it's at. In 10 years' time, what that would be, what that would look like, which I hope that I'm wrong, but I certainly think it's on that trajectory. Your question with the neighboring countries. So of course, Pakistan is the most significant, entity here, neighboring entity here. Pakistan is not just a rival; it's seen as an enemy. It's seen as an existential kind of other. In my work on Islamophobia and in India, I've referred to this. What the Hindutva project for India is for India as a Hindu nation, as an ethno-nationalist sort of democracy, where there is a normative idea of the citizen, who is the Hindu male upper caste person, and everybody else has, is further along the line with different degrees of difference from that norm, and where essentially the rights and the rights of minorities and others are subordinate to the goodwill of the majority, so that if they behave, they might be treated better. It's a whimsical sort of thing. The idea is that you have to be good. You have to be, you have to earn your rights rather than have your rights as just because of the fact that you are a citizen and an individual. So that's the project, and Hindutva leaders have been explicit about that, about the project for India as a Hindu nation. Why it works? Because various things, but in a piece called India is to Kashmir as China is to Xinjiang, I talk about what I call the moral wound of colonialism. It works because history gets used in a certain way that these leaders and these projects promise a way out of that humiliation, historic humiliation of that moral wound of not having been unable to resist. So a particular idea of what a powerful state is, and that, by the way, continues to be globally a particular idea of what a powerful state is. A state that has weapons, a state that is strong on its boundaries, that does not compromise, and that kind of invests in these things before it invests in health, education, minority rights, etc. That's the global idea of what it means to be a powerful state. So for the people, you can see why that might appeal as a project of pride and for the nation to be a powerful state. And that's, if you think about basically the genocides and the exterminations of the indigenous peoples that have been carried out in states that are now the most powerful states, I mean, there's no way in which we can escape the selectivity and the hypocrisy of what is currently a certain version of kind of structuring the state anywhere. So there is that. Now, whether it's possible to have done things differently, I think there the interesting thing was the historical experiment of secular nationalism in post-hyper-colonial India. The Hindu nationalist version of India, I mean, the RSS was founded in 1925, there were always at least two competing visions of where India was headed. And that other vision, which wasn't about India as only a Hindu nation, it had 100 problems, 1,000 problems, but it wasn't this vision. Now that thing has been subverted, and the idea is that, well, countries have majority religions. Western nations, whether they say it or not, are Christian. There are Muslim nations. Why shouldn't there be a Hindu nation? You can think at the level of tropes, how and why this works successfully, coupled with, as I said, the kind of histories. So for me, beyond the condemnation of the fact that, yes, this is morally really offensive, it's also important to understand how it's working and what can we do about it. And and the doing of it, I think, is also something that needs to be done at individual levels too, not just at structural levels. It's all our relatives, it's the friends, it's the people it's the people it's really hard to talk to on those WhatsApp groups. It's also at that level of trying to get people to see why this is not serving your interests. Because factually, the idea is to make India a strong power, rising power, but it's falling in all of the indices. Not just democracy, but every other media freedom, hunger, whatever. In every indices, it's falling. So it's not, so you may love this man, you may think this project is great, but is this project delivering what it says? Is it doing what it says on the tin? It's not even doing that. So, and it's not possible for it to do that, because hegemonic projects, hegemony is not just domination. Hegemony is where those whose interests are not served by something also subscribe to it. So as a hegemonic project, it brings together people whose interests are not in common, the farmers and the corporate stake, for example, the kind of the foot soldiers of Hindutva and the really kind of corporate billionaires. It's very hard. This is why the farmers thing was hard to deliver. It's easier to make them think that and harder to do it. And this is why I think it's possible to point that out. To your other point about dismantling Hindutva, yes, we were not part of it.
I'm so sorry to cut you off. I think we do have to wrap things up.
So should I?
No, actually, you can just announce the prayers.
Okay. Sure.
It's the last prayers of
I
this
see.
Ramadan.
Yes.
fast.
So,
If you are fasting, I believe it's not as like in 1 minute.
If you want
do
to,
have food
if you want to offer your prayers, is downstairs. We can have the prayers, and there is iftar afterwards. But you can continue.
Right.
People who are
So yeah,
fasting, they can.
I mean, I'm an animist and I'm not. Yeah. So I don't have that, but I'm willing to respect other people's religious beliefs. So yes, of course, please go ahead. With the thing that you were saying about the dismantling Hindutva project, you see the targeting of academics and the targeting of scholars and public intellectuals is not accidental. And it's not, again, happening only in India. You live in the US, you know the attacks on critical race theory. I've written about it in a paper called Misogyny of Authoritarians in Contemporary Democracy. If you think about the fact that Bolsonaro's rise in Brazil was staunchly predicated, like one key factor of that was the attack on gender ideology. So the attack in India too on progressive critical thought is a key part of this, because totalitarian kind of ideologies flourish by diminishing the public sphere and diminishing our capacity for thinking critically in the public sphere. And that's, and that's critical thinking matters. And that's why they want to shut it down. Any kind of totalitarians want to shut it down or want to be totalitarians. What is it? And yes, do we get challenged all the time? Do we get threatened? I mean, I don't know. I think men get threatened a lot less. But as a woman, as a Kashmiri, as a public intellectual, death and rape threats are a fact of life. I have letters in my office that I've received, phone calls that I get, violent trolling on social media all the time. In the aftermath of the 2015 head-to-head with Mehdi Hassan, where I challenged the RSS head person, Ram Madhav, both then and in the aftermath of the testimony, it was very difficult to even be on social media. So this is not just an abstract thing that happens. It's a very real fact. I mean, so yes, it happens to academics in the US. It also certainly happens to people like me in the UK. And you know, and that is a great kind of thing that we have to live with. It's not never, you know, it's never okay to have to deal with that level of hate and abuse and violent threats. The building of the common grounds, I mean, if there is one space for hope, I think that is it. I think we have to continue doing that because you know, that has to be somehow possible, because without that, what do we have? The question about Bollywood films on Kashmir, on all of this, but yeah, Bollywood films on Kashmir have always had a very clear agenda, right? You know, it's either Kashmir, what I call Kashmir the Beautiful, or Kashmir the Cruel. You know, the terrorists or the exotic view of it. And lastly, I think that's something that we haven't talked about here, but that to me feels really fundamental and an important part of all of this, is the question of gender and how significant it is both to the obsession with territory and territorial occupation and possession, and also to authoritarianism. So authoritarian and anti-feminist dispositions are very closely correlated, and that's my work on misogyny, as I said, deals with that. But also in India's obsession with democracy, gender, anti-nationalism, India's obsession with Kashmir, democracy, gender, anti-nationalism, I talk about the territorial aspect of it. You know, the obsession with this idea is partly exoticization and representation, it's cartography, this idea of India as feminine, as mother, as, you know, this thing, and also possession, and very explicit statements by people who say, well, this is like a marital relationship. It's, you know, so the using of violence is sometimes right. But, you know, because, so gender, I think, is also a very key part of how environmental, human rights, women's, and other concerns are feminized as a prelude to delegitimizing them in order to create the slide into sort of, you know, into more and more authoritarian behaviors that we are seeing in India currently.
Well, thank you all so much.
I think you
Go ahead.
can say something.
Very short, brief comment. I know we're running out of time. But what do you think should be the role of the multilateral organizations, UN, World Bank, ADB, also other countries, you know, US, Western democracies, since you are into international relations? Because when I see the Western democracies and their role in the Middle East, I feel it complicated. You know, what do you think should be the role of other countries across the globe as the governments, not diaspora?
So I think that's really important. And Western, there is definitely a space for domestic pressures on foreign policy, and I think that's why it's important to continually do that in countries where it's possible, to continually have that push on recognition of what's going wrong. So it's not as if China authoritarian, India great democracy. There's a convergence of behaviors, and that needs to be pointed out. And you know, so for me, doing that is part of what I do. Again, with the other. You said with countries in West Asia / Middle East, yes, again, very much so. So Modi has received honors from countries in the Middle East, including just in the aftermath of Kashmir's revocation. So the BRI project, Chinese investment, China-Pakistan economic corridor, not to mention the other corporate relationships between Indian billionaires and Saudi billionaires and so on, are all part of this complex story, which is why I was saying earlier, and I constantly try to say in my work, that it's important for us to look at this more internationally, because the neoliberal and the commonalities of the ways in which these nationalist projects work in multiple countries, and the neoliberal linkages, including kind of, you know, the very financial or corporate interests, are both kind of infra and suprastatal. There are these linkages that are important in terms of technologies of repression, in terms of investment, what happens in the name of development once occupations are entrenched, and so on, how things are being learned from one context and applied to the other. And so this idea that, you know, this is just about kind of, you know, automatically certain countries will take a certain stance on human rights or on Kashmiris or you know, about Modi, it's not the case at all. There are interests that are a lot more complex, and I think that, again, that's the reason why in other countries, in Western countries, it's important to kind of constantly put that on the agendas of the multilateral organizations and so on.
I'll just add something into that. We take example of around Kashmir. So apart from Pakistan, Turkey had been saying a bit, right, with Erdogan. But we know the way in which in Turkey the Kurds are treated very different. When we look at example of Uyghurs and the genocide against the Uyghurs, the Muslim majority countries are almost all siding with China rather than the Uyghurs. Hypocrisy is there everywhere, right? So from government, I would say we can keep pressuring, but I don't have much hope. But that should not make us dispirited in terms of mobilizing everywhere, because what we need is more consistency when it comes to minority rights, but minority rights and right to dissent without fear. So we have to keep challenging and asking for that. Of course, there will be issues where, let's say, whatever cause we may have may get hijacked by some interest. Take example of Uyghur cause. We know that their interest here, but same with Kashmir cause, there's interest, but that will always take place. Palestinian cause. We know that Palestine is whole discourse, but there are aspects of anti-Semitism that also fuel pro-Palestinianism rather than only be about Palestine. But all of that complication should not stop us from mobilizing wherever we are in whatever form to speak for minority rights, regardless of what those minorities name, what those minorities' identities might be.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So please join us.
Stop the camera.
Yes,